All right, so this is again a lecture made by Dr. Peer for this class.
Okay, last lecture of the semester. We're going to put
This is the last lecture, I thought it was the first one.
the big picture together here. So, talk about the history of life fairly briefly, and then macroevolution.
Article class with this.
So, if you look at the history of life, there's a number of generalized patterns that we can make. First of all, the climate, and I have that italicized for a very good reason.
And I'm going to introduce.
Distribution of oceans and land masses have changed, affecting the distribution of organisms. So,
He makes some good points in this. One of them is that um, I don't know if we haven't got into this. Maybe you can show, or maybe I showed you a video on this. But the idea of the origin of the Earth and the Earth being around 4 billion years old. It obviously went through stages where um, you know, it was a lifeless planet. It was hot and the crust cooled down and stuff like that. And we still have this molten area inside the Earth, the core that's still extremely hot, for instance. And so that's why you see, if you have fractures in the Earth, you have volcanoes, things like that. So the Earth has constantly been shaping. We had land masses where we had the continents at one time together. And if you look at maps, I can show other ones, you can see how South America and Africa would fit and how um, parts of North America could fit into where Europe was all at one time Pangea. And then it went through multiple, and the climate's been gone through periods where it was cool and hot and stuff like that. Times when we didn't have oxygen. So some of the first living organisms helped create the atmosphere. Some of it's like, we'll get into some videos and explanations about the origin of life. And again, the big thing is that sometimes creationists say, you know, we're there, you can't see it, so it can't be science. But again, we can still, like, what a scientist is basically kind of like a detective. You go to a crime scene, you weren't there to see the murder, but you're collecting the data and then piecing together what happened to the person. That's what a scientist is doing, especially from a historical perspective. But there are periods of time when the climate got rather hot and there was lots of CO2. This seems to be true, like particularly during the time when we had dinosaurs and reptiles were very abundant. As many of you know, they're in quotes cold-blooded critters, ectothermic, and so the hot planet was probably a benefit to them. Then we went through area times we had ice ages. But the one thing though nowadays is we are influencing our environment again by burning fossil fuels. We're increasing CO2 levels. And again, it might just be slight changes in the Earth's atmosphere, but it is changing the climate. So the climate's always been changing, but humans do have some role in it. I don't see how, you hear about people that deny the climate change. I don't see how you could go into a city like Chicago and not think we're having some effect on the environment. You think of all the planes and everything is. There's actually some shading that goes on now when all the jets are flying. And the jet streams are actually causes a shading effect. So it's actually rather complex how much is heating and cooling and shading. They actually said during 9/11 when all the planes were shut down, the temperature of the Earth actually increased a little bit because of less shading. But there is less shade. There's more shading now, all the smoking fire and stuff like that. So some of the ideas about the origin of life, it's going to be things where they speculate. Well, this is what would the early Earth's environment be like? It would be water. There'd be methane, CO2, lightning strikes, and all sorts of things. Well, they put this all into basically a test tube and saw that by simulating an early Earth's atmosphere, they get some of the simplest amino acids to form. Now, obviously, there's a big jump to life, but it's still interesting to see that biochemicals can be made by chemistry. And again, ultimately, as a scientist, and when we argue that science, we don't make claims about the supernatural or whatever. And ultimately, it comes down to the saying, I don't know. Ultimately, we don't know. We know that we have a good idea about that the Big Bang occurred, but we don't really know what happened before the Big Bang. When everything was, like the idea is that everything was a speck of like a kernel rise, and there was a quick expansion. And the reason why they think that is, they can take the Hubble space scope and they can see galaxies are still moving away from each other. Space is still expanding. They don't really know what. And so scientists always say nothing, all life came, or all the universe came from nothing. We just don't know really what came before the universe, or multi-universes. We don't really know that. So that's why we can only get down to like the first couple of milliseconds, or what, I don't know the exact time point that they can mathematically figure out by incredibly smart people that spend their lives doing it. So we should at least hear them out a little bit, I think. And so again, there's all sorts of different ideas about the origin of life. One of them was that some of the simplest biochemicals could be made, and then we'll get into other discussions about other theories on abiogenesis, which is the idea of life coming from non-life. And then they'll say, well, why isn't life coming from non-life now? Which, and maybe it does in some deepest regions of the ocean. But remember, if you already have cells running around, they're going to eat whatever, so they're probably killing off whatever might have been originating now. We'll get into more of that later. But so that's where this starts here.
Some people naively think that the climate change we see now is the first time it's ever happened. Well, it happens all the time. It's been happening throughout the history of the planet. The biota have changed as new forms originate, and at the same time, others go extinct. We've talked about the fact that over 99% of everything that's been on this planet is now extinct. So there are new things that evolve to replace them.
Just make sure you understand, it's estimated that 99% of all life is now extinct. And so how do we know that? By looking at the fossil record and seeing lots of things that don't exist. We also can look at different layers, and throughout the entire Earth, you'll see layers that where the dinosaurs are out. You'll see other index fossils at other locations where you don't see dinosaurs, or plants, whatever happens to be the index species. A lot of times it's just different types of invertebrates. There's a high level of invertebrates in plants, tissues that.
Is that 99% including like bacteria, like different types of bacteria?
Yeah, I'm not 100% certain, because I do believe that I have a feeling it's kind of estimating mostly larger multicellular animals and plants and fungi. Again, it is a estimate, and I don't know. Again, where the bacteria, I don't think we may be adding that into the equation, but the main thing is there's lots of plants and animals and fungi that don't exist. In fact, there might have been multiple mass extinctions that took place.
Well, from my time working with Dr. Andrea, they don't know. There's like 98% of the fungi have not been identified yet.
Right,
so.
That's a good point.
And there's millions of those species out
So there's lots of things that have not been labeled, and especially things I think about insects in my background, but there's literally hundreds of thousands of species of beetles, for instance. And you get some of this becomes estimates. And it's not that we're going through a major extinction right now. But this time it's more human driven.
Anthropocene.
Every time a Starbucks comes in, we might be killing something off.
So several times extinction rates have been very high, as has the diversification rates, and that diversification rates usually follow up after the major extinction events.
Does everybody understand what that means? Well, I can say when the dinosaurs go extinct, all of a sudden, there was little mammals that still existed. But there wasn't like, you know, I'm getting a little sidetracked. Adam and Eve didn't have pet dinosaurs. But there are little mammals around. You kill off bunches of big reptiles. It opens up new niches for these other animals to adapt and radiate and take advantage of that pressure. If this animal's gone extinct, that niche is now open for, so there's what they call adaptive radiation. So after the, presumably, and there's reasons why they think an asteroid hit the planet, they can measure this dust layer all around the Earth. So that's where, and they can, so have like, this is where these ideas come from. There's a reason behind it. And then they look at the fossil record, they see that you don't see dinosaurs anymore, at least at mass levels, right? And so then what happens is, then we see in the fossil record a lot more critters coming, more in the layer before that. So dinosaurs disappear in big chunks, and then we see a lot more mammals that didn't exist now running around in that higher layer.
And then extinct taxa have been replaced by unrelated but ecologically similar taxa.
So take it on that niche.
Few higher taxa persist very long. So this is.
So here they're saying that they think the universe is around 14 billion years ago. And a lot of that is based on how astronomers and cosmologists measure the universe, and they can measure the expansion, and they presume how things would have happened. So they know that, so we can look into the stars and see that the galaxies are moving away, even the moon's moving away from the Earth. So let's see what this says. Every atom in your body came from a star that exploded, and the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand. It's really the most poetic thing I know about in physics. We're all stardust. He'll read it back to us. You couldn't be here if stars hadn't exploded, because the elements, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, remember these are the biologically important chemicals, right? Carbon, nitrogen, organic compounds are the things that, you know, made life and Earth and so forth. I don't know if you realize this, but stars are factories for making a lot of these chemicals when they go through fusion. So what atom do you think is the most prevalent in the universe? What atom in your periodic chart? What'd you say?
Nitrogen.
Oh.
Carbon.
What is it?
Carbon.
Well, the one that's most predominant in the universe, in the solar system.
Hydrogen.
Hydrogen. So then hydrogen gets joined together. What happens when you join two protons together? You have helium. You join another proton, and what do we have? What does three protons make? I feel dumb even asking the question. Probably starts with a C though. Let's look it up. That's because I feel foolish now. I know it starts with a C. It has to. And then how many? Well, let's do one I know for sure. How many protons? What if you have 6 protons and 6 neutrons? What atom do we have? Yep, exactly. So 3 protons, what atom? Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I told you it started with an O. Lithium, right? So, so that's how elements get made. By they just join these protons together, fusions happening inside these stars, and Anyway, the bigger the more complex the atom, the more rare it is. Gold is much more rare, for instance. And then you think about hydrogen and oxygen joining together with water. I mean, there's this. So anyway, these are, of course, that's talking about our planet. But again, hydrogen is going to be the most abundant. That hydrogen all collides together, and we have fusion reaction. You know, I'm talking like I'm a physicist, like I know something. And then you have a star formed, and then stars die, and you know that's where a lot of these elements come from. So this part's a stab on religion. So forget that Jesus died. It's the stars that died that made it possible for you to live. No sacrilegious here.
Interesting quote by Lawrence Krauss.
No.
Every atom in your body came from a star that exploded, and atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand. It really is the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust. You couldn't be here if stars hadn't exploded because the elements, the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron, all the things that matter for evolution and for life weren't created at the beginning of time. They were created in the nuclear furnaces of stars, and the only way for them to get into your body is if those stars were kind enough to explode. And he takes a shot at religion. So forget Jesus, the stars died so that you could live. So we know that the universe began 14 billion years ago through the Big Bang. The Earth formed about 4.6 billion years ago from a series of collisions in aggregations of these smaller bodies. And we are a consequence of this, and we are just all stardust, kind of humbling to think about. This is an interesting chart. It shows you what you are composed of. So there's a quote by Carl Sagan: the nitrogen in our DNA, the calcium in our teeth, the iron in our blood, the carbon in our apple pies were made in the interiors of collapsing stars. We are made of star stuff. Pretty interesting when you think about it. So if we go back to the conditions of the primitive Earth, they were very different than what we see today. In the atmosphere, there was very little oxygen present. Instead, it was
So we could have survived in the early Earth's atmosphere.
mostly hydrogen. So if this was a live lecture, I would ask you why there was little oxygen present. So that's something you probably want to look into and look up, although you probably know the answer. And there was a hypothesis put forth by Operin and Haldane. They came up with this independently, and they suggested that this atmosphere promoted the formation of molecules because it was a reducing atmosphere, as opposed to our current atmosphere, which is oxygen rich, which tends to remove electrons. The atmosphere before was one that added electrons, and this caused the formation of molecules. So if you think of the term antioxidants, and they talk about the fact that you need antioxidants to overcome the effects of oxidants. Well, oxidants are from oxygen, and this has a negative reaction on your body, and it causes degradation of cellular material. So you want to consume these antioxidants to try and overcome them. Of course, there's only a limited amount that you can do for that. But in addition to having this reducing atmosphere that led to the formation of molecules, there was also a lot more lightning and ultraviolet radiation to provide energy to spark reactions. So Miller and Urey conducted a series of experiments to simulate these conditions to test this so-called prebiotic soup hypothesis. And they found that amino acids were produced within 1 week.
Remember this one I just talked about. So this is where that. So this is back in 1953. They were already trying this kind of stuff. So within 1 week, we had amino acids forming.
Pretty impressive that just within 1 week you get the building blocks of proteins.
This chart,
so this is
carefully. So this is roughly, you know, it's listed as millions of years, but obviously this would be 4.5 billion years ago. That's 4,560 million years ago, so 4.5 billion years ago. And so there's these different eons, and this is something I would have to look at pretty regularly to keep it in my head. But there's these different eons, which are kind of like more, explain more things on a more gross level, or large level. And then you have specific eras. So like Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and you can see in the Mesozoic there's different periods. Like the reason I'm pointing out these because of familiarity that you probably already have, but like there's a Cretaceous or a Jurassic period. And there'll be different types of dinosaurs in those different periods, for instance. Or Carboniferous, that's when you're seeing, I guess, Carboniferous trees and plants or whatever. They're not trees. Well, I call them trees, but plants. And then we started seeing flowering plants, I think sometime at the end of Cretaceous. I'd have to look it up to be sure. And then we have the Zooxanic era, then you have these other periods, and I'm sure they're always being kind of discussed and debated, and then you can see the corresponding years with it. But and then we got these different epochs. So we're in this Haliozene epoch. But the one way I've heard it described is if you were to, imagine this, whatever, me putting my arms out, I'll just say from my chest, you get the idea, out to my fingernails. Most of that first half would be no living life on Earth, the first half. And then you start getting into like dinosaurs in their wrist. And then at the fingernails is when, maybe at the tip of my fingers, when I start seeing humans. And the fingernail at the very end is when you could talk about the last 1,000 years or so of civilization. So most of the time, Earth would not have been thought of as a planet with life on it. If you'd been living on Mars 4 billion years ago, you would have thought of Earth as having life. Again, this is based on, we go and try to figure out how they figure this kind of stuff out later. But to me, it would be hard to imagine that the planet's only 6,000 or 10,000 lives. The creationists propose, in my opinion. But we'll get into all that discussions later.
This is the geological time scale, and you can see the different divisions here. In the eras, you got Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and then Cenozoic. We're in the Cenozoic right now. Then you have the various periods, and then the epochs there on the right. The time frame is there on the left in millions of years ago. So from the earliest bacteria-like organisms arose cyanobacteria, used to be called blue-green algae, about 3.5 billion years ago. So it took.
I was a little bit wrong. So you wouldn't necessarily, I talked about half my arm or whatever. That really, you're just talking bacteria, from my chest out a little bit. The first 500 million years before you start to see something living.
Blue-green algae?
Yeah, blue-green algae was, or bacteria anyway, cyanobacteria. Not algae, because algae technically has a eukaryotic cell. Mm-hmm. And so these are prokaryotic cells, the earliest cells that have been prokaryotic. Then cells become more complex. Have you ever heard of the endosymbiotic theory? Or prokaryotic cells swallow other prokaryotic cells, form kind of a symbiotic relationship, and that's where organelles apparently come from. So the first living organisms are prokaryotic cells. They can photosynthesize, they can start to change the atmosphere and make it more oxygenated through photosynthesis.
About 1 billion years from this transition of no life on Earth to some living forms. Once the cyanobacteria then evolved photosynthesis, that meant oxygen was available. And for about 2 billion years, only the prokaryotes existed. 1.5 billion years ago, the first eukaryotes appeared. So
So now we're talking 2.5, basically 2 billion years had to go by before we start to see eukaryotic cells. Remember, eukaryotic cells are cells with a true nucleus. Eu meaning true, and so endosymbiotic theory or endosymbiosis is the idea that organelles like mitochondria and chloroplasts evolved from bacteria eating other bacteria that can do the photosynthesis or the cellular respiration. And remember, mitochondria does cellular respiration to make ATP. And plants do have mitochondria, by the way, and chloroplasts. They have both of them. So the bacteria that we call protokaryote, so they form a symbiotic relationship. Initially engulfing the other one, but instead of killing it, it became a symbiotic relationship, which means they're both mutual. Both, in this case, symbiotic means they're living together, but it becomes a mutualistic relationship where they both benefit. Maybe initially to start off as not mutualistic. Anyway, it forms a symbiotic relationship.
The ancestors of us. And this happened through endosymbiosis. This is where you have the production of mitochondria and chloroplasts. They were bacteria that were ingested by some sort of proto-eukaryotes. Also could have been parasites, not clear what that was. This allowed for much more efficient cellular respiration. Moving on then to the Paleozoic right here.
There's the Paleozoic.
So during the Paleozoic life, we had the so-called.
This is when you start to see lots of life in the oceans. And again, they call it an explosion because it goes from not seeing any of this in the fossil record to a huge abundance. Once it really took off, it really takes off. And so you start to see skeletonized marine animals appearing.
Called Cambrian explosion. This is when most modern phyla of skeletonized marine animals appeared because that's where life was at. It was in the marine environment. This includes the first vertebrates or the agnathans pictured there.
Agnathans mean they don't have a jaw. And so you can do, remember how I talked about a molecular clock last week? The idea that you could look at the DNA or the proteins, amino acids, and get an idea of how closely related things are and how much time might have passed. So the agnathans would have shown up during the Cambrian period.
There on the left. Molecular clock estimates suggest that these phyla actually originated long before the Cambrian, so we just haven't found the fossils yet. So the Cambrian now is considered to be a period of rapid diversification within clades that actually evolved much earlier than the Cambrian itself. So the Cambrian, the so-called Cambrian explosion, actually had a long fuse. They evolved before that, and then you saw rapid diversification within these groups at that time period. So picture kind of depicting what was going on there. What caused this massive explosion of life forms? Well, it all boils down to the availability of oxygen. You had oxygen present, so organisms could evolve multicellularity, larger sizes, and these explosions filled up all of those niches in the marine habitats.
With this new type of metabolism.
Moving from the Ordovician to the Devonian, we saw the Osteichthyes and Sarcopterygians evolving in the Devonian. The coelacanth, long thought to be extinct, was rediscovered in 1938 off the coast of Africa. That's a coelacanth there on the left.
Just going back, Iman, what are these animals? You work with any of them? Obviously, they're fish.
They have bones.
Yep. So you start to see boned fish.
Yeah.
And looks like jaws.
Yeah.
What is this one here? Do you know? Is that the lungfish? And why is lungfish important? We're starting to see maybe movement from water to land.
Ichthyes and Sarcopterygians evolving in the Devonian. The coelacanth, long thought to be extinct, was rediscovered in 1938 off the coast of Africa. That's a coelacanth there on the left. First terrestrial organisms evolved in the Ordovician. These were small animals related to liverworts, not particularly exciting, but they were the first terrestrial organisms, so that's a major advancement. And by the end of the Devonian, the land plants diversified quite a bit. You had ferns, mosses, and some large trees. Then you saw the appearance of the first terrestrial arthropods, spiders.
On the landscape before, we're really seeing animals on the landscape, terrestrial landscape.
Scorpions and millipedes. Then we saw the emergence of the first terrestrial vertebrates and tetrapods, including the ichthyostegid.
These are real fossils. In fact, the person that found this fossil worked at the Chicago Natural History, I believe worked at the Chicago Natural History Museum. And we have an example of that fossil out here in the hallway. I don't know if you guys remember seeing it over here. So they had fish-like organs, and so that's why there's all these critters that are kind of like transitional species. So we start to see lungfish who can start to crawl out a little bit and breathe. They go back into the water. Then you start to see the formation of amphibians. And then you see a new feature like reptiles where they can start having skin that they don't need to jump back into the water to survive. They can start to form eggs. And then eventually the eggs of reptiles, forms a hard shell so they don't desiccate. So if you think about it, so that means, fish were laying eggs, amphibians were laying eggs, reptiles were laying eggs, and then birds started laying eggs. So now you know the answer to what came first, the chicken or the egg. It was the egg. Because eggs were out there before chickens.
Amphibians pictured there on the left. And of course, the reason why they moved from the water to the land probably has to do with escaping potential predators, escaping competitors. And once you moved onto land, everything was wide open. All these niches were available. During the Carboniferous, then, you had land masses forming Gondwana land in the southern hemisphere, and then you had a series of smaller continents up there in the northern hemisphere. This time period saw the emergence of the first winged insects. Amphibian diversity increased after the emergence of the ichthyostegids on land. And then we saw the ancestors of mammals occurring during this time period.
So here you can see how the continents were all joined together as a single, well, maybe not a single mass, but a big mass. And then they moved through plate tectonics. And so I think they moved like fingernail length every year. And you can see how they were joined together, like here's South America joined with Africa and Europe and
so during the Permian, you saw the continents emerging to form Pangaea. Sea levels dropped to their lowest level in history, and then the climate was drastically altered due to this. And you can see this time frame over here on the left and the movement of the continents. Go back to the beginning there when they were all together. Now they're moving apart. And of course, this is still happening today. Figure on the bottom there makes it a little bit easier to appreciate because you can see the different countries and entities designated on those maps. So you can imagine how the climate was going to be altered because when everything is combined like it is here, you have all these kind of vast areas of interior land that get the same sort of moderating effects from the ocean, kind of like us. Then we're stuck there in the middle of the continents, we have miserable summers and miserable winters because we don't have those moderating effects. So when all these continents were crammed together, you had this on a much larger scale. You lost those moderating effects, plus you had all sorts of new organisms coming together, competing with one another. During this time period, as a result of the merging of these continents, you had what's been described as Permian hell. So there was a plume of magma that reached the surface of the Earth somewhere in China, intensifying the greenhouse effects that were occurring during that time period. Then you had a second larger plume that occurred in Siberia that killed nearly all life on the planet. The Permian mass extinction was the most significant extinction event in the history of the planet. So we talk about this, don't talk about the most recent one, although I guess we're experiencing the most recent one right now. But the one that we tend to think of is the one that occurred about 65, 66 million years ago that wiped out the dinosaurs. That one was nothing compared to the Permian extinction event, where well over 90% of all species went extinct in a relatively short period of time, from 5 to 8 million years.
Again, there's like, I don't know, it'd be nice for us to list down all the different extinction periods. We think we're going through one now. But there's been like there have been several. The one that we all tend to think of is the asteroid hitting and killing off the dinosaurs, but apparently there was a premium mass extinction that took place where 96% of the species that were living at that time went extinct. Again, I don't know how they estimate all that and what they're estimating fully. Because then you started having to wonder about the ocean critters and stuff too. So, but either way, a lot of organisms died. And how do we know that? We can look at the fossil record and not see those species later.
Then we come to the Mesozoic era, which is right here. So Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. This, of course, is the age of
premium.
But the one that we tend to think of is the one that occurred about 65, 66 million years ago that wiped out the dinosaurs. That one was nothing compared to the Permian extinction event, where well over 90% of all species went extinct in a relatively short period of time, from 5 to 8 million years.
So here's the premium right here. So this is when that extinction took place. And then we start to see the rise of the dinosaurs. And then we have another extinction that takes place. And this is when the Earth gets rather hot and it's much more habitable to reptiles. So like being the reptile part of the zoo. You ever been in there where it gets really hot and steamy?
Then we come to the Mesozoic era, which is right here. So Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. This, of course, is the age of the reptiles and dinosaurs. So it took tens of millions of years for organisms to recover from the Permian hell. Pangaea split into Laurasia, which included North America, Europe, and Asia, and then Gondwanaland, which included Africa, South America, India, Australia, and Antarctica. And then it split into the current configuration of continents that we know now by the end of the Cretaceous. The Earth's highest temperature in the Cretaceous, it was much higher than today. This is another thing that you hear when you listen to the news. They say, oh my gosh, this summer, this is the hottest it's ever been on the planet. No, I don't think so. It wasn't even remotely close to what we saw during the Cretaceous. It was so hot during that time period that vast stretches of the ocean couldn't support any form of life. The Mesozoic as a whole was 57 degrees warmer. And the Cretaceous itself was 68 degrees warmer than what we experience today. So when you hear those people in the media and these other goofballs talking about how hot it is, they know nothing. It was nothing compared to what was happening during the Mesozoic. That's why we saw this, huge number of reptiles. In terms of plant life, it was dominated by the gymnosperms, so things like ginkgos. There's a ginkgo leaf right there. Of course, we still have ginkgos today.
That's what
Angiosperms and pollinating insects appear.
When you think about early life, don't you tend to think of dinosaurs and things? But realize most of life wasn't that. It's just that kind of special period where the Cretaceous, the Mesozoic, the Jurassic, and so forth.
Appeared, leading to a greater diversity of terrestrial species because so many of them, of course, are dependent on the flowering plants. So I mentioned this is the age of the reptiles. This is
There's a
when
lot of different types of dinosaur species. And then these would be different clades and so there's a lot more than this Tyrannosaurus rex running around, Brontosaurus.
saw the dinosaurs reaching their maximum diversity. And then, of course, the extinction at used to be called the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary. Now it's called the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary. Marsupials and eutherians evolved at the end of this period. And then we have the Cenozoic. So that includes the
So this is the end of the dinosaurs, and then that's when you see the mammals really take off, the Cenozoic. And birds and things like that.
the modern era. During this time period, a significant event affected organisms here in North America because the Bering Land Bridge existed connecting Asia up here to North America. Then we saw Gondwana breaking up into South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia. At the radiation of the mammals, but again, molecular data suggests that they evolved in the Cretaceous. Marsupial fossils are found on all continents, but of course today the only location you're going to find marsupials is, of course, Australia, and then South America, and then here in North America we just have the lonely possum.
Yeah.
What does the word radiation mean in this context?
I believe radiation means that you went from like a handful of mammals to a lot of different species and their movement across the planet. And so, as you can see, that Australia is had a heavy number of marsupials, and then they probably radiated into a lot of different species in that area. But the only marsupial we have in North America is the possum.
Most of the South American species went extinct after the North American placentals moved down and outcompeted them.
The other thing about what you'll notice is like Australia will have animals that kind of take on niches, like I guess with Tasmanian devil and some other ones that you won't find, but they take on like platypus. They'll take on roles and niches, and so that we have the thing called converting evolution or analogous. Trying to think about it.
Well, the birds, the ostrich, the emu, they are convergent evolution.
Convergent, that's the word I was looking for. So they can take on some of the roles. So you'll see like, bats and birds as a kind of a convergent evolution, even though they're totally not related. I mean, they're related, everything's related ultimately, but, as you know, bats are mammals and so forth.
Then we have the Pleistocene. It lasted about almost 2 million years, but it's critical to our understanding of how organisms are distributed today. Many people just see what they see today and they think that's normal. Well, people that have lived longer and what they saw, whatever it is, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, they think that's normal, but it's all relative, okay? There was at least 4 major glaciation events. The most recent one occurred 18,000 years ago. During this time period, the sea levels dropped because, of course, that water was all stored up in the ice. This allowed for many land bridges to form, continents to be connected. So we already mentioned the Bering Land Bridge that connected Alaska with Asia. This allowed the invasion of a number of organisms into North America, including humans, but also mammoths and bisons. Humans occurred here at least 20,000 years ago. These estimates are constantly being revised as they find new fossils. And during this time period, the distribution of many organisms contracted southward into what we call refugia, and they're called Pleistocene refugia. So during these time periods, this is really promoted speciation because populations that were contiguous, they receded into, say, for example, Florida or down into Mexico, Central America. And then once things warmed up, came back together and they no longer recognized one another as the same species. So the distribution of organisms as we see today have resulted in the past 8,000 years or so. After the glaciers receded, the climate rewarmed, and organisms started to redistribute themselves over the course of North America.
You understand what he's saying? Basically, all the animals are kind of connected into this line, and then they get further apart, and then they become unique species that can contribute.
We've talked about the fact that the landscape was very different during this time period. We had huge numbers of megafauna. The diversity of megafauna was pretty wild, and much of that went extinct, 13 to 14,000 years
Back
ago.
then, we would have had
So
like
in North America, we had camels.
mastodons and sloth bears, all that would be running around North America. And then most of this would, as you know, we don't have mastodons running around. We don't have hairy elephants anymore running around, but we have lots of fossils of them. Let's see. 300-pound beavers, giant sloths that would have been, couldn't get through that door. You can see a lot of this stuff if you make a trip up to the Chicago Natural History Museum too. Have you guys walked around there and seen those kind of things? Worth the trip. But so even in North America, we had camels and all this kind of stuff. And we had bears that are much bigger than the bears we have now. Saber-toothed tigers. And then a lot of these animals went extinct.
We had giant sloths, a variety of large cats, 300-pound beavers, and this is why they were called megafauna, because they were large.
There's like a sloth. Hairy rhinos. That represents the saber-toothed lion or tiger. I said tiger.
Some pictures depicting some of the wild things that were roaming around North America. And then here's some other ones. You had a variety of bears as well, large predatory birds. If you've ever been to California, hopefully you've taken a trip to the La Brea Tar Pits. If you've not been there, hopefully you will get a opportunity. I would strongly encourage you to go there and visit this. It's right outside of Rodeo Drive, so you probably have heard of Rodeo Drive in terms of kind of fashion trends or whatever. You want to go waste a lot of money on expensive clothing, that's the place to go. Well, the La Brea Tar Pits are just down the road from that. When you pull up, it's like you're going to an oil change shop. It's due to the deposits of tar, and it's why it's so valuable, because that tar trapped all sorts of prey species that were then attracting predators. And so we saw huge numbers of organisms being trapped there. And so we have a good kind of reflection of what was going on there in terms of species diversity. So here are some of my pictures. There you can see
tar pits. I've been there before. It's really cool.
Some of the buildings in the background in downtown Los Angeles. They've got this all fenced off here. This is one of the tar pits. Palm trees, of course, because it's Southern California. There's some of the bubbling tar that can be found throughout the area. This is one of the excavation pits. You can't see it very well here on the slide, but this is a kind of a accounting of what they found in these pits, so that you can see they have all these squared off, and then in the barrels they put all the different fossils and the bones that they recover in those pits. These are dire wolf skulls that they have found there. This is just a small number of them, which I'm sure you heard about dire wolves in the news. They said that they've, what's the term they're using? De-extincting the dire wolves. They've recovered dire wolves, which is not the case at all. All they've done is revise like 20 different genes. These are just gray wolves with a few tweaks to their genome. In reality, there's thousands and thousands of differences between dire wolves and modern gray wolves. So something to keep in mind. But this is a reflection of what they found there in the pits. This is one of the giant ground sloths that was found there. So moving on, what was going on? Why did all these organisms go extinct? Climate change. Remember when we talked about the work of Jared Diamond, and the people were settling down from hunter-gatherers to more of a agricultural-based system. Climate change was one of the reasons for that. So Berkman's rule, remember that. That's one of the consequences. If you are big, it's not good to be big in a warming climate. If you can't evolve a smaller body size very rapidly, you're going to go extinct. So certainly that contributed to the extinction of a number of these organisms. And then a number of other hypotheses, one of which is called the Pleistocene overkill hypothesis. This one suggests that humans, as they moved across into North America, they started to hunt these animals, driving some of them to extinction. So, for example, when it comes to woolly mammoths, it's thought that climate change caused the initial decrease in their numbers, and then humans kind of put them over the edge. If you look at extinction patterns then over the course of history, there are 5 major extinction events, and you can
5 major extinction events. You got everything scrunched over here. And we have Paleozoic, Mesozoic, of course the Cenozoic is where we're at right now. We have the Precambrian, and we have the what did they say? They say the Cambrian was the explosion. Was it the Precambrian explosion? No, it doesn't matter. It'll be on your exam, not mine. Okay, let's see what he has to say.
You can see that here. It's your geological time scale. These are the number of families present. So the first major event occurred here at the Ordovician, and usually oftentimes the name changes here, and these are reflected after major extinction events. So the Ordovician to the Silurian saw a major extinction event. You saw another one here in the Devonian, followed by the Carboniferous. And here, and these are reflected after major extinction.
What's so then there was these, life takes off, number of families of species. So here it says 500. I'm not sure even what species they're talking about. And you see a dip, and then you see another dip. That was the pre-meat extinction. They said it was 90%, but it doesn't look like 90% in this picture. Cretaceous, which is this is when the dinosaurs were killed off. But again, I don't know where they're getting these numbers from, because there's obviously a lot more than. I don't know. Again, you're talking about families, not species. Again, we're talking about families, which is kingdom, family, class, order, family. I don't know how many families exist now. I figure there's got to be hundreds. Okay.
Extinction event. So the Ordovician to the Silurian saw a major extinction event. You saw another one here in the Devonian, followed by the Carboniferous.
Families.
And then I mentioned the Permian, where more than 90% of all marine organisms went extinct. That's what was living at that time period. So this is supposed to reflect the pre-extinction period and all the diversity of life. And
That's huge. So they went from all this to basically back to what looks like mussels and clams.
this is after that major extinction event, not much left. The end of the
Then they'll have another, of course, if you go look at another log group, there's another radiation explosion after radiation.
Triassic was a fourth one. And then the fifth one that we tend to think about happened at the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary about 65, 66 million years ago. We are sure of this because of the Chicxulub crater, which occurs here in the Yucatan Peninsula. There is a large concentration of iridium there. Iridium is very rare on the planets. It is very common, however, in asteroids and meteorites. And so it's pretty clear that this area was struck by an asteroid or a meteorite. There's also a high concentration of what are called microtectites or glass particles from the intense heat that occurred during this time period. You add all that up, it's pretty clear that this area was struck by some sort of an asteroid or a meteorite.
Well, that's the neat thing about science is there is a reason for why they say this kind of stuff. You notice the fossils are missing. They notice there was this big crater. So there's at least a logic behind all of it.
Well, following extinction events, we typically see adaptive radiations. These are periods of diversification of species to fill in all the available niches. You can see
Cichlids are famous for that in Africa. So you can look at a famous lake that's there. I'm trying to remember the name. What's the name of the famous big lake in Africa? The super big one that has all the cichlids. I think it's in. Well, we'll find out.
some of the examples. Some of the best examples that we have are the cichlids from the Rift Lakes in Africa. And you can see the great diversity in a very short period of time there on this phylogeny. Seen similar patterns of the Hawaiian honey creepers
So these
on the Hawaiian Islands. All the
different roles, different niches, and become different species. So they would start off with just a small group of cichlids, and then they took off and took on all these different types of jobs and niches. And that's what happens when we talk about like the finches. In the Galapagos, they maybe had a small group and then they diversified into these different niches where they can, some are good at eating insects, some are good at breaking open big seeds, some are. So it starts off as a single species or a handful of individuals, and then they adaptively radiate to all these different niches. That's why we don't see, because again, it would start off with just a small group of fish, cichlids, and then those cichlids would become very diverse, taking all these different jobs. There is another fish there, so that's why they're all kind of originated from this small group of fish or whatever. You don't see sharks in those lakes, for instance.
So now many of them are extinct due to introduced species, but also one of those is mosquitoes carrying malaria.
All right, so now we're at a break. Rest your hand for a minute. Pause the recording.
We also see changes in size of organisms over evolutionary time as well. This is called Cope's rule. So it states that they tend to increase in size as the lineage increases in its existence. And you can see that in these horses over here on the left, start out very small and then gradually get bigger and bigger.
And you can see they become different species. And again, they're looking at the fossil record, finding fossils and then they start putting it together like going to the crime scene, finding evidence, and then trying to piece together an idea, hypothesis, to destroy the test. And then they gather more data.
Some of these results could be from drift, but chances are that's a very small effect on the overall change in size. There are advantages and disadvantages. The advantages include mating. So this is especially going to be true when you've got males competing against other males, and the larger male is going to be at an advantage in those situations when they fight. Survival, because the bigger you are, there's going to be fewer individuals that can eat you. Thermal regulation, and of course, if it's not too hot, because that's going to create another problem if it becomes too
Cold.
warm. Bigger organisms also tend to live longer, and they can also have larger brains. On the other hand, if you are bigger, you need more food, and so in times of scarcity, that is going to create some significant problems. The other issue is you have longer generation time, so it's going to take those organisms to a much longer period of time to reach sexual maturity and then to start to reproduce. So evolutionary change within those lineages is going to take longer as a consequence. So if that's the case, if Cope's rule is the case, why aren't we seeing more just gargantuan species? There's a couple of issues with that prevent that. Number one is that increases in age. That particular group means it's going to be more vulnerable to extinction just because the fact that we've talked about 99% of all species on this planet have gone extinct. There's also physical limits to a number of organisms in terms of their physiological capabilities, and insects are a good example of that because they have to be small enough for the oxygen to diffuse through their bodies. Flying birds is another issue. You can only be so heavy in order to still achieve flight. It's one of the major changes in flightless birds is that once they stop flying, they just become bigger and bigger. And of course, competition, if the niche is already filled, is also going to prevent organisms from occupying that niche. So this is a study by Heim and colleagues from 2015. They analyzed the body sizes over more.
A group of organisms can occupy a niche in a particular environment. So it's hard for two different species to deal with a similar niche. So often one species will displace another species, like having two species of squirrels in the same area, one tends to displace the other species in the same niche. So that's one of the things we're talking about.
17,000 genera of marine organisms, and they showed that the volume increased by a factor of 150 since the Cambrian. So this is geological time, this is body volume, and you can see this steady increase in time or in size over time.
Animals tend to get bigger over time.
Another rule worth considering is called, actually it has three different names, the island rule, island effect, also known as Foster's rule. This one suggests, actually I prefer the definition by Van Balen, that body size converges on the intermediates on islands. So large organisms tend to become smaller, which is called insular dwarfism, whereas small organisms tend to get larger, which is called insular gigantism. There are good examples on Santa Cruz Island. I did some research on Santa Cruz Island. It's right off the coast of Santa Barbara. In fact, you can see in the parking lot of UCSB, the island there. So 10,000 years ago, there were these pygmy mammoths, and these ascended from larger mammoths on the mainland. But once they got to the island, they shrunk in size. They were about maybe 5-6 feet at shoulder height. And then these are called scrub jays, and that's why I was on the island. Island scrub jays. It's the only place they exist, so they're endemic there on Santa Cruz. They are much bigger than the mainland species, so their ancestors got to the island and then became bigger and bigger. So a good example from one island with two disparate species. Some other places in the Caribbean, you can see rats and guinea pigs that are the size of black bears. That would be an interesting encounter. So Foster, and why it's called Foster's rule, he explained this, that smaller animals get bigger when predation pressures are relaxed because they don't have to hide from potential predators, so they can become bigger. It's also going to be more advantageous when you become bigger because you can avoid being prey. And then larger animals get smaller because there's going to be less food in those restricted areas on the islands. You see the same sort of thing occurring in human evolution. Homo floresiensis, pictured here, was been found on the island.
Well, here again is different types of hominids uh, that are now extinct. You know, we're Homo sapiens. We have Homo habilis here, Homo erectus over here, Homo floresiens. So there's lots of different hominids.
Islands in Southeast Asia. This is also known as the
People-
Hobbit.
Yes.
And these guys were tiny. You can see them in comparison to Homo habilis and Homo erectus. Apparently, there was a fossil just found here within the past week, or just reported the past week, of another human that was probably even smaller. I haven't seen the details yet, so it may not be that Homo floresiensis is the smallest of our ancestors. But the point here is that that same sort of rule applies to humans. So last thing we'll talk about here before I show a couple of videos is the tempo of evolution. We've already talked about these a couple of different occasions, and the fact that Darwin was the one who proposed gradualism, that organisms change gradually over time, and then that kind of accumulates to these larger changes that we see. We've talked extensively in this class over the semester that in reality, some of these changes can happen really, really rapidly. And then the alternative to gradualism was proposed by Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould. We talked about Gould quite a bit. They proposed punctuated equilibrium, which suggests that species arise quickly, but then they remain unchanged for most of their existence. So you look at this figure up here, this is a depiction of what gradualism is. You get these gradual changes, and they're using birds and bird bills. And this is another one illustrating punctuated equilibrium. You get this rapid change initially, and then very little change there over time. And the punctuated equilibrium model really isn't in favor. I suppose if you look hard enough, you might find somebody who thinks it's an appropriate model, but it's likely a relic of the fossil record. So we just got done talking about how some organisms can change so rapidly. Well, if you imagine, and this is what Gould was doing, he studied snails in the fossil record. Not every single one of those snails is going to fossilize. So you're missing out actually on a lot of change. And so that's probably what's going on here. It's just a relic of them not being able to track this in real time instead of relying on these fossils. And as a consequence, it's not really a good model of how evolution occurs over time.
We can talk about that.
Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do.
Saying, what's the difference between punctuated equilibrium versus gradualism, and what his argument was? So gradualism is the idea that things are slowly evolving over time, that this bird is becoming a different species that ultimately has this long beak. While Stephen Jay Gould, who was a famous paleontologist, would argue that there might be a big rapid change in evolution that leads to a loss of seeing the intermediate. But his argument is, well, maybe that intermediate wasn't around long enough to see many fossils to account for that. So it's arguing that then gradualism still exists, is what Ryan's saying.
Really a good model of how evolution occurs over time. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do is play two different videos, kind of a metaphor for time in the history of life here on the planet. And the first one here on the left, it's a clock, and you can watch the progress of the clock down there on the bottom right. And it's going to last for 60 seconds, so 1 minute. The thing that you'll notice about that is that things are really boring up until the last 5 seconds, and then that's where you get all this really, really rapid change. And then the one here on the right, this one is based on a football field, and they're going to take you from this end zone to this end zone, and same sort of thing. Not much happening for the first, 95 yards as you progress to the end of the field here. Things really start to get exciting there towards the end.
Formation of the earth. Outgassing of molecules.
See the time changing.
Formation of oldest rock. Prokaryotic cell organisms.
3.2,
Photosynthesis by blue-green algae.
2.9.
Prokaryotic cell organisms. Last banded ion formation.
Now we see multicellular organisms 1.3 million years ago.
Formation of ozone.
So everything happens.
Okay, so this is the football field. Let me speed this up.
Standing next to some mountains that are millions of years old, and the Earth is itself 4.5 billion years old. How do I even wrap my mind around that length of time? That's a good question.
I thought that was.
How can you imagine 4.5 billion years? And how does that compare to the amount of time that humans have been around? A geologist gave us the idea to use a football field as a metaphor. And that's exactly what we're going to do. At this end zone, we've got the present. And at this end zone is the moment our planet formed. Earth's entire history stretches the full 100 yards in between. Every inch is 1.3 million years. Let's start at the beginning and take a walk through Earth's entire history. For the first few 100 million years, the Earth was bombarded by rocks from outer space. But now it's starting to calm down. And way up here, 3.8 billion years ago, life begins. We're talking simple life, single cells floating in a vast ocean. Now these cells are figuring out new ways to get energy. They're evolving to harness the power of the sun. Photosynthesis starts past the 20-yard line. The air here is mostly carbon dioxide and nitrogen, but right around here, little green cells start making oxygen. And up here, about 2.3 billion years ago, oxygen starts building up in the atmosphere. We're halfway down the field, and we just got the kind of atmosphere that humans can breathe. For the next 1.5 billion years, it's paradise for single cells of every variety. But as we move down the field, cells start working together. And by the time we reach the 18-yard line right here, there's lots of complex critters floating around. It's 800 million years before the present. Things are about to get really interesting. Here at the 13-yard line, we've got an ozone layer. And here, a sudden explosion of diversity. Fungi, sea anemones, mollusks. 530 million years ago, animals take their first steps on land. In the ocean, fish appear. Land plants, insects, sharks, amphibians. It's been 4 billion years since we started, and here at the 5-yard line, we're just starting to see the first mammals and dinosaurs. We see Stegosaurus dinosaurs right here about 176 million years ago, but we don't see the T-Rex until about 4.5 feet from the end zone, about 68 million years ago. Look, the T-Rex is closer to us in the present than it is to the Stegosaurus way back there. Oh, and there's a catastrophe at the 1-yard line. 66 million years ago, a meteor or volcanoes or climate change or all three killed 75% of all species. But life rallies. This yard is the yard of mammals. We've got armadillos, giant whales, wolves, and here a foot away, the great apes, our family. Hippos, mammoths, lions, Lucy, almost human but not quite, saber-toothed tigers, cattle. Then 200,000 years ago, this is where we find humans that look like us. That's just 1/8 of an inch from the end zone, the width of this light bulb. This is all of human experience, but everything we call civilization, agriculture, cities, books, science, these don't appear until we're 2 hairs breadth from the zone. The width of this filament.
So does that make you feel insignificant?
We just want to say thanks to the Morgan State Bear.
So what about, what kind of comments do you guys have about all that? And there's no right or wrong answers, just. And then right at the last, there is the class we're teaching, right? The one molecule.
What was Eldridge and Gould's explanation for why they believed the species have roughly evolved and then didn't change anymore?
I think it's because of, if I remember right, was it related to niches being filled? But once you get, that's what I would think. I think it's worth us exploring more, but I believe it's related to, once you fill niche, you can't maybe have stasis at that point. So the adaptive radiation reduces, but that's worth looking at more. Okay.
Like species or different species in that niche?
Well, my understanding is organisms can't have trouble occupying the same niche. So those don't have to be the same species, but so different organisms.
Higher level of competition.
Right. Yeah, so that's my understanding is not any particular niche tends to be filled by one particular species or organism.
So I guess with that logic, how exactly do all bird species live at the same time? Like out on campus, there's so many species of birds that live here.
Yeah, and are they all in the same niche, or because there's going to be seed-eating ones, fruit-eating ones?
Right. Is that just how they do it? Is they just take turns? I don't know if food they eat.
Well, or will they specialize in different types of food? But
Right.
I'm not sure of, that's a good question, how many bird species fills a particular niche
Right. Because they are
in a particular area.
physically small and can live in smaller numbers, but there's so many.
Yeah, I think it's worth us taking a second to think about it.
I have an observation. When I travel from Galesburg to here, about 3 miles west of Galesburg on 34, there's an eagle nest bald. It's been in there at least 10 years. And when they are visible, or the male is hunting right now, all the red tails that are normally out flying around, they're hunkered down in trees where they can't get at. So they do overlap on predation, but the dominant one.
And our animals, I mean, again, like you have different big game animals and or big predators in Africa, but they're slightly different in their niche, even though they're all predators, like what they eat, right? And some of that ends up resulting in predators killing each other off, right? So lions will kill off the leopard if it gets a chance. But again, leopards are going to be a little bit specialized, a little bit differently, even though they're both predators. But that's something I want to look into more. So it's
Like owls hunt at night and hawks in daytime, so they've specialized within the same niche.
And then a lot of times our vultures head down south, and then the eagles come into the area. And eagles do tend to act like vultures and a lot of dead stuff lying around.
Is the ocean big enough to be able to support many niches being filled? Like so many fish, so many sharks.
Mm-hmm. And imagine there's a lot of micro niches and micro habitats, and so there must be an incredible number of niches. Some like kelp garden or algae areas, so in different levels of water. I don't know if your colleague can say any more about that, but anyway, let's see if we can find out any more information on that.